Hi, welcome to a LudoNarraCon Fireside Chat with Xalavier Nelson Jr., head of Strange Scaffold, director on El Paso Elsewhere, and a writer of many, many other things. From Remap, I'm Rob Zacny, and Xalavier, I'm happy to be sitting down and chatting with you today.
It's a delight to be sitting and chatting with you, Rob.
I guess there's a few places to start this off, but I was thinking before our conversation about, when I was a kid growing up and thinking about, like, wouldn't it be cool to work in video games? And, well, I found coding murderously boring. I don't know if that's been your experience or, where your chops are at with that. But that was my first hurdle for, like, hey, why aren't you in game dev? People are like, you should learn C. Start with BASIC, though. And I was like, I would rather be beaten with sticks every day of my life. And so when I sort of imagined, like, what would I do in games? Well, what I could do was write. And I sort of figured that, maybe I'd be a game story writer. And, one thing I would often hit when people would be like, you have to play this or that game. It's got amazing stories. Is frequently I would sort of sit there and I wasn't amazed. It was a fine story, but very, very tropey genre work that, like, was, common across a lot of other media I consumed. What was maybe special about it was it cropped up in the context of a game. But something I would always run up against is the fact that, like, a story inhabits such a different space in a game than it does in other media. And the job of creating a story or a narrative in a game is, or maybe ought to be, a profoundly different approach to the work than sitting down with a blank sheet of paper and writing a short story, or, God help you, trying your hand at a novel.
Yeah, I think that when we're talking about game stories, you mentioned that a lot of tropey genre work that outside of games would be seen as unremarkable. As soon as you put it inside of the context of a game, it comes off as something revolutionary, is because something does fundamentally change. It's a little bit like the difference between reading Shakespeare and seeing Shakespeare performed. It is a fundamentally different relationship with the work. So in games, you do see this very interesting interaction where the audience can recognize pieces of things that they've seen before. They know that you basically just saw Aliens or Lord of the Rings and then just did your own things with the serial numbers filed off. But because it is in an interactive context, even if you're not doing something transformative with it, even if it's not a choice-based narrative, even if it's just something you get to experience yourself, something fundamental does happen. And it's been really interesting to see the genre kind of grapple with that as a reality over time, because we're hitting a period in games right now where pulling out some tropey genre work just in itself, taking pieces of things you've seen before, if only because they look so similar now, right? Metal Gear Solid cinematography still holds up really well, but on top of it, it's also a game that takes you through so many evolutions that are both interactive and linear. If you just make a movie in games, it looks like a movie anywhere else. It looks like we now have games that look like Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, which is a thing I never thought we would hit. So seeing the medium grapple with audiences not caring as much that you've spent $100 million, $200 million on this game story because it's fundamentally similar to other things that they're seeing, and you now have to answer the very direct question of what does this adaptation do and how is it felt? It's been really interesting to see that impact the landscape over time.
Yeah, I remember when I was first getting into the space as a writer and a critic, and I did a better job of keeping up on academic discussions of games and, what designers were sort of the conversations happening in those spaces. But one of the things that was certainly a talking point a lot when I started my career was this idea that you were better off if you leveraged sort of the inherent interactivity of that the more games mimicked traditional storytelling, the more they were kind of letting themselves down, not exploring the full possibilities of the medium. And I think you get this sort of radicalism or radical dedication.
I think radicalism
to a
is a good
medium.
term for it, actually.
Yeah, because it kind of reminds me of people who are like, filmmaking never recovered from when they introduced talking, right? From the invention of the talkie, it is a purely visual medium.
And people who today are like, television is not where it's at. It's only films, only film, capital F, in that box.
Yeah. And I think we've gotten away from that, certainly. And I think there's a lot of different approaches that can be fruitful. But as you gesture, like, you still hear a bit of it, and I think there is probably something to that, insofar as, to the point you were making a moment ago, if you are just you just can't blow hundreds of millions of dollars on like dropping multiple movies worth of content into your video game, unless you're Hideo Kojima, basically. Like, you can't just be
Hideo Kojima
like,
or Neil Druckmann.
Yeah. Other than that, you probably aren't going to be able to do that. You have to find some sort of other approach. But I also sort of think a lot about, there are times I strongly identify with that notion of like, games should like leverage their inherent interactivity for narrative, and like have that be a part, like a core function of how the game works. And then I'm brought face to face with the fact that I spent the last month playing Like a Dragon, Infinite Wealth. And that is a game where you just it's very classic RPG. You wander around a world, you get in very simple fights, and then the game gives you little like treats, like little M&Ms of story and character interaction. But it's so well done that I don't care that there's the a sitcom basically unfolding in front of me in installments. But I don't know, like, the thing that I come back to again and again when I sort of like consider these debates about like what a video game narrative should look like and where it sort of fits, is that, to the point you're making, like, there is something about that relationship between the gameplay parts and sort of even less interactive like narrative parts, where if they sing together, you can achieve that effect of, on the written page, this would be really flat. Happening in a game where, like, for some portion of the program you're inhabiting the character, it sings. I don't fully get why.
One of my favorite examples of this is, I think the term is kinetic fiction. Are you familiar with this?
No.
So I'm going to make sure that that's the actual term, because it comes from, that is not the actual term. But the idea of stuff like twine and hypertext, and how if you even just take a linear story and make it to where when you click on certain words, it unfolds before you, it feels different. Interactivity changes everything. It can be the simple, as you said, spice. Family dog is doing his thing. Interactivity can be the simple spice on top of a game story, but it can also be the thing that makes it transformative. And I think the thing that game writers grapple with on a daily basis to this day is the fact that you sometimes don't know what will be the thing, what situation you're going to be in. Whether you're in a situation where interactivity is going to be quote unquote king, or where interactivity is going to be just kind of underlaid under your story. We're still caught by surprise all of the time by, even on individual sections of a game, what ends up getting needed. And this is especially impressive in the terms of AAA game production, which I've now had the honor to contribute to several times now. And on those games, because of just how much content is in those games and how many pieces are involved, you have animations and voice acting and lip sync, and you might have it in multiple languages, and this all means that you write a story and build a story 3 years before the game comes out. And then roughly a year before the game releases, you look at the pieces you have and go, oh, dang it. This feels totally out of place. This doesn't work. This line if I move it over here, actually makes the entire thing flow better. Writing in games and narrative design is as much the active management of the narrative over time as the game goes on as the original construction, which is part of where game writing is very different than film or television or literature. And it means the job is always exciting, but it also says that because every machine we build is different, every narrative design also needs to be different in intentional ways, because you either stumble into greatness or kind of fall into mediocrity bit by terrifying bit. And managing that slide is, I think, something that a lot of game writers, especially if they're veterans, are very aware of.
I am curious how the experience, you've worked on projects where you've been effectively in charge, directing the entire thing, versus coming in as a, hired gun effectively, coming in to, do narrative design in a project that's already well underway. And I'm curious, on projects that you've led, are you able to make it a more coherent coherent process between like the creation of the story and the telling of the story and then the making of the game, or is that just kind of inherent to game development? And even when it's your show, you're still frantically drawing the strings between the different chunks of game and narrative you put out there.
Because I come from such a narrative heavy perspective, and because really precise production and pre-production is such a big part of my creative philosophy as well as that of the studio, we end up having to shift less blocks in a massive way over time. But I still do run into the situation, even on projects that I do my auteur thing at Strange Scaffold, where a core assumption has to be massively altered. So I think one of my favorite examples of that is a game we co-developed called Can Android Survive? So Strange Scaffold handled the creative direction side, and A Priori Digital, a great group of folks over in England, built the bulk of the game. And it was supposed to be, originally was a playdate pitch, which we were like, this is cheap enough and a tight and focused enough vision, we can just build that on our own outside of the playdate and put it on Steam. It was inspired by things like E.T. on the Atari 2600. It was a story about gaining power and being dehumanized through the gaining of power and endless manipulation by the military-industrial complex. And the game fundamentally wasn't working. The narrative delivery was not working. The game mechanics were not coming together. The ambition of the team and what they could execute on amplified the intention of the original game in certain ways that where before it was almost Doom style because it was built originally for the playdate. Now you have full 3D motion, but now you have full 3D motion, you have to build environments that account for that, and you're building narrative to a degree that accounts for the player being able to express more and do more. And the game just was not coming together on a fundamental level. And making a bad mech shooter when things like Titanfall 2 exist is not a recipe for having people care about your game. So as the creative director, I kind of asked the team to take a step back as we did a design and direction pivot. And I looked at the ingredients that we had, and I saw that the one thing that was working is we had this Mario Golf style jetpack jump mechanic. And you could calculate how much fuel you were burning to leap across the lunar surface. And I came back to the team and I said, okay, this is not a mech shooter, not a simple or minimal mecha combat game. This is a battlefield courier game. You are a mecha battlefield courier, highly expendable, launching yourself across the lunar surface, totally focusing on evasion. We redid all enemy types. Any the enemies weren't working, so we took out the enemies and we put their tracking onto turrets. All threats were either immobile or had very simple tracking, almost in a very modular puzzle-scape kind of way. Previously, the game world was procedurally generated. I made the call to reverse that decision and build out a small sandbox for you to do your mecha courier thing in. The narrative delivery was unfolded in a different way that aligned with the flow of the player. So optional packages would carry narrative, as well as the more packages you gathered in general, the more narrative would be delivered to you. And we step by step basically looked at this interactive landscape and at a game that wasn't working, and by bringing it all into alignment on both the direction level and as a team, ended up with a game that actually really delivered on its promise and what it was saying. So the idea of being surprised by a game or finding a game not functioning because the original core assumptions or ways you departed from them end up making the vision not function anymore, the more you bring it into alignment in a holistic way, the stronger the game is. And that's so much of the hired gun work I've done, is being parachuted into a situation where the story was not functioning, or a game was 90% together, but not quite coming there, and asking what seems to me the very natural question of, what are the tools we have? What is the game telling us? And how do we make this game without destroying people in the process? And holistic processes, holistic narrative design, I think that's part of why games have over time been able to exist in tropey or otherwise stereotypical genre spaces and elevate them, because hot dang, when everything's coming together, there is nothing like it. And I think this is part of why we're dealing with really big struggles right now in terms of remakes, because those remakes were built according to constraints for narrative, for gameplay, for mechanics, how the player interacts and thinks through their journey in the world, that were holistic, because you're making a game for the PS1. You've got limitations. Now publishers are throwing $100 million, $200 million budgets at remakes of those games, and in the process of altering them, sometimes we're not seeing the course of action and set of processes for that game not updated to align with that, and you end up with really janky constructions where the graphics are there, the budget is clearly put there, but you attempted to align a game which was built to convey emotion through flat characters. As soon as those characters, their eyes and their lips are all moving, it becomes uncanny. I'm interested to see how they deal with that on Metal Gear Solid. I think they're calling it Delta, Metal Gear Solid Delta Snake Eater, that remake that they're doing. Because Kojima in particular does so much to align his games with their interaction forms and with their graphic limitations at the time. As soon as you bolt more emotive characters onto that, does it fall apart, or does it require a massive amount of reworking to figure out how that impacts every piece of the game? Everything impacts everything else, which is why games are so dangerous to build and also so magical.
In your example, I think one of the things we were describing now is a Battlefield Courier game.
Yeah.
Does that necessitate, and do you even have the luxury of reimagining what that story is, given that now your place in the world is so different than the project was originally conceived? Like, if you set me a task where it's like, write a story about being a combat mech pilot, I'm going to write one kind of story. You tell me, write a story about being a mech pilot who's just like running messages across like, a battlefield, writing a different kind of story, right? Like, one of these things is, the Matrix, the third Matrix movie, and the other might be like Gallipoli, right? Or something like that, where it's, or more accurately, you're now the kid running around with a wheelbarrow full of ammo in the final Matrix movie. But those are two different, like, when you hear like the way it's reframed, when I hear how it's reframed, I'm thinking, well, that sounds really cool. That's a really clever solution to the problem of like, you don't like the way the game you're making feels. But I also, when I hear that, to me, that seems like, well, isn't that going to just whip around and point at now a story that needs complete reworking? What happens at that juncture? Does the story get retuned, or is it easier than you might think?
The story does get retuned. There's especially the storytelling. So, just as an example, if you have a narrative built all around death, your character having a death and rebirth loop, if your character goes from embracing or fighting death under very tight constraints to avoiding death and mastery of the game systems, meaning that they can spend maybe 5, 10, 20 minutes not dying, you have to fundamentally rethink your narrative. This is actually, you can see a really interesting example of this in Baldur's Gate 3, where I didn't fully understand the camp system. So I was talking to other people, and I was saying, Astarion still hasn't told me, small spoilers for people out there, that he's a vampire. And they're like, well, have you gone back to camp? And I was like, well, no, I was wondering where camp is. I was expecting to find it on the map or like have a place where I could set up a camp. They're like, no, it's just in the options menu. I was like, oh, so you can just go to a camp anytime you want? I was like, well, then I have to spend all these resources. And they're like, well, have you been using your long rests or your short rests? I said, I've been trying not to. And they're like, the entire game is built around you using long and short rests. So you get into combat, and to recover from combat, you recover health through a long or a short rest. And because I played really efficiently and I built my build in such a way, and I was kind of scraping by, and I'm used to Divinity Original Sin, I did not actually end up using the primary markers and rest beats that are used to deliver narrative. So I was playing Baldur's Gate 3 wrong. And the game hadn't told me that I was playing it wrong. But also, there's a degree to which so much of, your individual experience with D&D or with RPGs is going to define that. I take full responsibility for playing Baldur's Gate 3 wrong, but I think it illustrates a really interesting example of games where I think more so than anything, changing around a story from a battlefield fighter to a mech courier, depending on what type of story you wrote before and how it was delivered, like what story, may not actually change all that much. I don't remember doing that much rewriting. What changed most of the game story, and what changes a lot of game stories in my experience, is story structure and delivery. Hades is a fundamentally different game if it is linear as opposed to a roguelike. And when you build a roguelike game, but don't build a roguelike story for it or make the same affordances, everything falls apart. And we have seen big delays on projects, both indie and AAA, because midway through they go, you know what, we could make this into an open world game. And because the delivery methods and the structure have been altered, actually so many of their assumptions from technology to narrative go out the window. It all affects everything else over and over again. And the more you impact the structure, that's the more you end up needing to change the story. Because, again, in just my personal experience, rewriting a scene, if it goes from a linear game to linear game, not all that much work, actually, especially if you haven't already done the recording and the cutscene animation and so on. But if you tell me that yesterday we were making a third-person game, and now today we're making a first-person game, and you have choices in cutscenes, so many things get brought up. Are those choices on a timer? Do characters have to say things while that timer is ticking down? That's an entire other class of dialogue. Potentially boosts your narrative budget so much. I'm rambling a little bit, but one last thing I'll cite to this is Fallout 4. Mm-hmm. Bethesda apparently wanted to use a silent protagonist, according to an interview that I saw. But at the time, you couldn't really get a major game funded at that level without a voice protagonist. It was said, hey, that just is not what the market expects and or needs. That was what they were told at the time. So they had a voiced character. And in the process of having a voiced character, because your voiced main character can respond in a variety of ways throughout the game to every character they meet, that meant that a huge part of your total narrative budget, the amount of lines you can write, the amount of lines you can have animated and lip synced, those were the lion's share belonged to the player character by necessity, which meant you could have less narrative in the world, or you had to rely more on terminals in the world. You had to, for every character the player interacted with, you had to have very precise bounds on their role in the overall story, because you can't just have a fun little side path where you have a series of jokes with one NPC, because the player having their forward responses every time the NPC says something, half of your main quest budget just got blown on a funny little side character. And they were talking about the freedom they felt with Starfield, where they were able to say no voice main character and put those lines and reactions more so on characters in the world than those being centralized in the player. And from the player side, as someone consuming this story, you don't know about narrative ratios, but you see the final impact. And I talk so openly and transparently about what Strange Scaffold does, and as much as I can legally, to the overall work that I do in the medium, because I feel like the more people understand the magic and the misery of how small game design decisions end up altering everything for your final experience as a player, I think the more players will appreciate what they love and do not love in detail about their favorite games.
To your Baldur's Gate story, I'll just say this. One, I have no cause to drag you at all for... I'm the king of missing mechanics completely, playing through games. Like, I just routinely, I'm like, wait, there's an entire, like, I'm supposed to have this ability in this game? I never got it. Things like that have happened to me. The other thing, though, is I think the D&D rest system is one of those, like, awful things that it's only because the thing's been around so long that people internalize the logic of it. And I've never gotten on with it at all. Like my instinct is kind of similar to yours, where it's like, yeah, everyone's half dead, but I got some potions, some bandages. We can probably do one more fight. And that fight's a nightmare, and I'm save scumming it and all that, but I probably will do that. And then it's like, well, cool. I saved another rest. Good work. It's like getting grenades and shooters. Where it's like, oh, I don't want to spend this powerful ammo or resource. Might need it later. You end the game having just like struggled through on basic stuff. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I think there's really, to the grenade point and potions, it's been interesting seeing more come into the narrative space from not just gacha games, but in general relationship builders. So Neon White having a flow that says to really master a level, you got to find a gift in it. And every single time you get a gift, you can give it to a character. And those characters will have conversations with you and offer you side quests as a result of those interactions that tell you more about the world. And that very tight narrative loop coming from things like relationship sims, and us seeing more of those game worlds get grafted together. Fortnite has choice-based dialogue now. You can walk up to characters and go through dialogue trees, pulling that from, of course, the language of RPGs, complete with a somewhat radial conversation system. Seeing the genres really start to play in each other's spaces and pull things out, particularly when it comes to modular pieces you can add to overall game loops to make a experience compelling. It has been one of the most fun things I've witnessed in like the past 10 years of narrative game design, because it mirrors the Wild West that was the early 2000s, where you had games that would strap on wild mechanics to each other. Doshin the Giant, by all accounts, doing a god game, plus it's kind of like a relationship builder, and it's a little bit of a interactive wallpaper, and an RTS a little bit. That fusion of genres you kind of saw die out in the Xbox 360 era as we moved towards higher budgets, greater gameplay clarity, the the blessing, the tyranny of a gamepad, and now we're seeing that flow back with really intentional narrative design choices, and I love it.
I'm curious, just because you've come in, like, when I have heard some like old heads in the game space talk about narrative design back in the day, something I hear a lot of is that basically you had like really code focused teams or engine focused teams or like level design focused teams that really did think that story was like a term I would hear that I don't think you hear very much at all now, unless someone's like a true graybeard, is Chrome. The idea that story itself is just Chrome on a story. That's not real. You hear it more in wargamer spaces, I think, which I spent some time there, where it's like, oh, that game has like 3D models instead of good hex counters. That's just meaningless Chrome. And one, this is how your genre ends up being a huge niche that like hardly anybody plays anymore because like people like Chrome. It's shiny. But story can be treated that way too, where what people are here for are the game mechanics. They're here for the levels. They're here for the action. Story, I don't know. Why give it priority? A writer can come in and weave a story around the game we've effectively already made. Have you encountered any of that, like, being brought in a project and it's like, here's the table, here's the ingredients, they don't make sense, but make something out of it? Or has the look of dysfunction changed?
I think you still deal with the same attitude, but funnily enough, relationships with publishers and players over time has altered this. So you'll have a lot of teams where previously in the past they wouldn't hire a writer. Now they will resentfully hire a writer because their publisher thinks that narrative is good, or they see that players think that narrative is good, so they're like, I guess I'll freaking hire a writer somewhere. And next thing you know, you're entering a team where this is a somewhat hostile environment. And one of my favorite things to do, even just from the Can Android Survive example, is to come in on a game and look at the ingredients and at the table and build the best story I can. And I've managed to assemble sometimes award-nominated, award-winning stories from that. It's such a satisfying challenge and a very fun, creative space for me. But sometimes you'll step onto those teams and you'll also see that they don't want you there, but they feel like they have to have you there because they kick their feet and say, I guess story matters. And that is, I think, the way that Chrome has evolved over time, where there are still people who believe art direction doesn't matter. There are people who believe that the story you use and what story elements you use and what narrative delivery methods are coming together for that story, they don't believe that those matter. But they feel a pressure from the rest of the industry to at least dabble in those spaces, and so have on their artist or their art director, or put more of their budget into animation, or so on and so forth. And it ends up in... It's fascinating and speaks to the craft of so many people in games that you would be surprised how often that is the story. Where a game that has amazing art direction or artistry visible in it from a visual perspective was dealing with a hostile environment for that. And the same goes for game stories, where you have really talented craftspeople who come into teams and they aren't necessarily wanted there, and it isn't necessarily believed that they add that much to the game, but they're given their little narrative hole to play in, their mud sandbox. Mm-hmm. And then people end up saying, man, I didn't really like the game all that much, but I love the story. And then, depending on the team, everyone involved takes credit for it and says, yeah, we were really excited about that story all along. Or they grumble and go, did you see the game mechanics on level 3? We were inspired by Mario. 1-1. Made something fall over. The environment for story is perceived, I think, now as having an inherent value to players, but that doesn't mean that always has inherent value to devs.
Yeah, I can sort of see that, where it's like, we'll sell on this because we have to. It's not what we want to be selling necessarily. I'm always curious, like, that attitude where it comes from always seems so backwards, like to the point where I sometimes wonder, like, what business people think they're in, or what they think games are. Like, everyone has their pet. Games are like this other media analogy, but like one of the things I come back to a lot is games remind me a lot of opera. Insofar as opera is neither a fish nor fowl, like, medium, right? It's like, it's song, it's poetry, there's dance, there's like art and design, like, it lives and dies by its sets, by its costumes. All these things have to come together. And if you isolate any one part, you're never like, you're very rarely going to see the best, like, ballet or the best dance in opera, because that's not primarily what it's there for. You won't, obviously, like, the odd aria, from an opera, like, becomes the thing that you hear everywhere, but for the most part, a lot of music in opera is just there to fill in the story and, keep it going to get to the next big,
It's a combination of elements, it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like you can't, especially now, games really defy that reducibility, if they ever had it. You can, going back to, say, Mario 1-1, your example. You can say, well, it's so exquisitely crafted, it's so beautifully tuned, everything just feels good. It's also got a catchy little ditty. Like, that's the other big part of it. It's like, it feels fun to play because there's a fun little ditty playing over everything you do, and it just, like, looks like a fun, attractive world. There is no, even there, you can't reduce it down to this is pure platforming, baby. It isn't. Like, there's very few. I'm not sure I can think of any games really that, like, sing without some other element being there to be aesthetically arresting.
And what you've nailed down is that it isn't for players. And to a degree, let's speak about other mediums. There are filmmakers who don't believe much in a script. They believe in the perfect shot and the set of perfect shots that take you through a film, the primacy of cinematography. They're wrong because
frequently there's an editor making the entire thing work in the background, but
absolutely, but a director like that, the shame of it all is that a director like that does not see or acknowledge the editor. All they see is their set of perfect shots that they took, and then the editor puts that together, and everyone praises the cinematography, and they said, "Yes, I took those perfect shots," not seeing the hand of the editor. In a similar way, one thing I've come to as we use voice acting in more and more of our games, El Paso elsewhere featured so much dialogue, and Life Eater is a horror fantasy kidnapping sim, and I wrote that entire story, and we started making all of the quote-unquote cutscenes, the images that that text gets overlaid on, and I said, for such a grim piece of subject matter, if you can actually hear humanity, if you can actually hear vocal performances, and we find the right performers for this, it's going to reach players in an entirely different way and make this game palatable in a way where it wouldn't have been before. Having made games where that use and believe in the power of voice acting, I also see the power of voice direction and voice editing. RJ Lake did the voice direction editing on both of those games, and the degree to which very small, invisible choices by him selecting the takes, results in games that have people DMing me in tears. That is powerful. And when you, as a game designer, right, because game players take it in as the agglomeration of elements, which is why I think it is so important to see games as holistic and as formed of contributions from people that big and small all play a part in a player's experience. When you have gameplay is king, gameplay first, or even narrative first people who say the gameplay doesn't matter. All you need is a story, a real story. If they throw aside the little ditties, the atmosphere, the role of art and gameplay, and how even a very minimal layer of mechanics that holistically supports their narrative intention makes their story. Doesn't just make it better, it makes their story. That is, I think, something that games is becoming somewhat more aware of, and it is something that the audience always sees, and it is when creators lose their way and start to ignore their collaborators and their role in the wider construction of the thing that we see a lot of things that could have been just home runs fall apart.
Do you think, I guess, no, I don't want to put it that way because I think the question almost answers itself. But I do want to talk about the ridiculousness of some of the tech demos we see of, like, AI is going to come in and do a ton of writing for, at the base level, like these AI NPC demos that we see sometimes. And I do feel like, and I've seen, again, some, like, longtime designers speak to this anxiety of, it's not going to work. Like, it's just not going to do what people think. It's not going to, result in better games. Anyone who's ever had to edit something written by AI knows that it screws things up in ways that are harder to fix and identify than anything written by a bad writer. But they are going to try because it promises you can get rid of all these people, all these annoying creatives, and you can have AI do all this stuff that is, admittedly, I think at times can feel like scut work. I've never had to write barks. Doesn't sound fun. I know voice actors who've had to voice them. Sounds awful. But I don't think anybody, I think there's very few people who are sitting down, to a spreadsheet full of, barks and being like, I made it. This is what I came here. This is what I came here to do. But I'm really skeptical that even in that limited use case, AI is going to do anything you want it to do. I think we notice bad barks way more than we notice good ones. But, like, even that is a thing where I think it's very easy to say, well, you don't need an actual, like, good writer to sit down and do that. Unfortunately, I think you do. Even if it's a lousy use of a good writer's time, I'm not sure you can get away with just farming it out.
No, I've also seen the difference between good writers or great writers working on a bark sheet, or what we call a bark matrix, and junior level writers. They aren't bad writers, they just aren't as experienced, and you can tell the difference. The difference between here's a grenade and grenade. It feels objectively, having now worked on, bark matrices that sometimes have just thousands of lines, it does not feel like you have done something worthy for the advancement of the game typing in grenade ! It doesn't. But the power of finding a concise way to describe a gameplay scenario and communicate that to a player in a way that's flavorful and meaningful across hundreds of uses of that phrase is incredible. It's an entirely different form of storytelling. One of the people who really took me under their wing to show me how to do this was Jordan Thomas when I worked on South Park Snow Day. A lot of those barks, or at least the original versions of those barks, were things that I wrote. And he said, what you have to get out of your head is the idea of writing a good line. If the bark matrix is good, then the barks will be good. But what you're going to be doing is storytelling via ratio. You have 7 lines in this category because of how frequently the player's going to be encountering it, or 12 lines. Or you have 15 and they're all going to be treated uniquely because of this use case. He showed me bark writing because I'd written barks before, but I hadn't been on a game that's so bark heavy, and a roguelike multiplayer co-op experience, as South Park Snow Day has come to be, is a game that requires a lot of barks because you have a lot of enemy types, a lot of scenarios. It's a comedy game. Also, people are going to be talking over the barks. So you need to have barks that sometimes get people to stop and say, "Ha ha, what a funny line." And for the most part, though, get out of your way. This is all a long way of saying that like scut work is not scut work. And you can tell the difference when you have a junior versus a senior lead or director write those lines. Now, they still might not write those lines because they have to write other things, but nonetheless, artistry is evident there. And when we talk about AI and its role in quote unquote eliminating scut work or taking care of it for you, what it's saying is, to the exact point that you made, as soon as you say that a piece of your work is not meaningful for the player, we're just going to have something spit out stuff, then you've kind of lost a bit of the battle because you no longer care about the player's holistic experience. In the AI NPC interactions in particular, I think are very interesting through that prism, because if I make a 100-hour RPG with AI NPCs, and players, we know most players don't finish games. If they spend 20 of their 30 hours just walking up to random people on the street and saying, hey, so how's the weather today? And they say, the weather in Day City is wonderful. Which means that that's time they didn't spend engaging with the rest of the content I spend money on. I'm going to be frustrated. I'm going to be upset. Because as a studio head and director, we put so much money into all the rest of this that people are never going to see. The sad thing is, we know generative storytelling works because people are already doing it now. Caves of Cud does amazing things with it because it sees it as meaningful. Store Fortress does amazing things with it because it sees it as meaningful. We have games that build pieces of their narrative, or even just take modular pieces of the narrative, right, and build and make them more significant based on their context. Hitman is a master of this. Hitman: World of Assassination makes you think about individual NPCs and about routes and about pieces of a world in a way that is expansive and explosive because they see it all as something to care about. And I think, very frankly, a lot of AI NPC companies don't see it as something to care about. They see it as a labor saver. They see it as a space for quote-unquote content. And content without meaning has no power. So do I believe that...
That's exactly it. Like, it feels like it's the contentification of everything, where I think we've had over a decade now of people looking over the hedge at big franchises like GTA and a lot of the Ubisoft house style of open world game. And I think, well, it's all just stuff, and a lot of it's like kind of throwaway or can feel kind of low quality as it is. So what's the difference if we have AI do it? And I think the answer is, like, for the most part, those franchises, the thing that makes them work is it feels like you can explore so far toward the boundaries before you start hitting places where it's like the illusion meaningfully breaks.
I mean, look at the at the I think it's Sterling Garvey, the Sterling Garvey quests in Fallout 4. People hated that. They hated the idea of being of not. I don't think they hated the idea of even repeated missions, because we see games where people do love them. But it's a matter of context, and they felt that they were getting served out meaningless quests in a world where there was a lot of opportunity for meaning and a lot of meaning that they weren't experiencing because they were off doing another repeated mission. So I think that AI is a tool like anything else, and we will see people use it in a way that does feel meaningful. But I think the basic nature of just add AI to your game to make it endlessly rich. The example I would use as a counterpoint is every time I've seen a streamer use AI GTA or AI Skyrim, they play for maybe even a few hours, and they're goofing off and they're asking dragons, hey, did you fart? How often do you fart? And the dragons will come up with some response. And the giggle of novelty wears off, and those players go back to going to RP servers where they interact with other human beings, and they go back to base level Skyrim or into even, mediocre quests written by other human beings, because AI can give you material, but it can't make that material meaningful. So, I'm not scared of it necessarily. I am more scared, much like I am of anyone who doesn't see story as meaningful or gameplay as meaningful, that it isn't going to, that we're going to see those people make decisions that end up eroding player experiences because they don't see the meaning in the rest of it.
All right. Well, as I kind of expected, about we're coming up on time here, and there's like 12 other things I want to get to now and like raise. I think we'll leave it there for now. But it was a fascinating conversation about your job and your experiences in the space, and looking forward to. I haven't played it yet, but I'm looking forward to getting around to Life Eater when I get a chance.
Thank you so much. This has been great. I will be looking for opera recommendations from you in the near future, because I haven't been into opera, and another medium that takes advantage of a bunch of elements coming together to make something better than the sum of its parts. That's something I'm interested in experiencing.
All right, sounds good.